Another important aspect of working with text in your HTML documents is understanding how the browsers are going to deal with white space in the markup and breaking your text across lines. Now, generally, browsers are going to ignore white space in your documents, in your block elements, and in your inline elements. So even if you have 10 spaces between a word, it's going to show up as a space. If you have 10 line breaks in your markup between your H1 and your H2, they're still going to show up one right after the other. You're not going to see those carriage returns in the source marked up. What if you do care about the white space, though? What if you have a poem that you want to use, or you've got some other kind of text that you want to actually format with white space? Whether that's things like indentations or extra space between items, you can use the pre element or pre-formatted text. When browsers see the pre element, they will respect the white space that's inside that content or that text that you contain within the pre. We also have the notion of the break tag, the BR, which gives you an explicit line break. So if you have some text or some elements that are in line and would normally flow across, and you want those things to break apart, you actually want a line break, you can explicitly use the break element to ask the browser to put a line break in there. You can also use the HR or horizontal rule if you actually want a visible line to show up. Now, this was all trendy back when HTML first came about. These days, most people will use images and style sheets to render any kind of visual breaks that you might see. But it is one option for identifying that horizontal rule, and you could certainly style it to look different ways. And the final item are character entities. So these are representations that you put in your markup. They use this syntax of the ampersand, some characters, and a semicolon. And these character entities tell the browser to render a particular character or to consider this entity as a particular character. Popular one is the non-breaking space. This allows you to put a space in between two inline elements, for example, and instruct the browser that it shouldn't break at that point. I don't want you to break this line apart here. So if you're wrapping text, if you're wrapping elements around because the window is smaller or larger, then don't do that breaking here. Keep these two elements together. Also, if you want to represent anything that would normally be interpreted by the browser as HTML markup. So in our markup, we have the less than and greater than symbols all over the place around our elements. So if you actually want to show a less than sign, then you need to use the ampersand LT semicolon or the less than character entity. Or for greater than, we have a similar item there. So you use these character entities in order to render characters that would normally be interpreted as markup. In my document, I've fixed things up a little bit to use my block items correctly. So I now have a div called overview container that contains all of the content in my overview. I might use that later in the course in terms of styling or scripting. Maybe I want to make that section collapsible through some script. So I've identified the whole section, which will allow me to treat it as one element and collapse the whole thing visually. I have my paragraph here and my objective headers. And then I've also got a new div down here that I'm going to use for some examples. So let's look at the white space. Let's take our paragraph from up top here. And we'll put this down in an example. Let's go in here and we'll put an H2. We'll call it examples. And now in here, we'll come in and this will be H3. So our example is white space. I'll call out that particular part of the document. So you'll notice all of this paragraph is on one line. But what happens if I do this? If after every sentence or section here, I put some carriage returns in the source and save it. When we come down and look at the rendered content, you'll notice it's still all rendered as a paragraph. Those carriage returns are completely ignored by the browser, and it's really rendering based on these elements. It sees that this is a paragraph. It's going to take all the content within there and render it as a paragraph unless it sees some other HTML element that instructs it to do something differently. So even if I put a ton of spaces between these browser names, you'll notice, again, I get a single space. So the white space is considered something that is not going to be preserved in these cases. Now, let's go down a step further and let's take an example for this where we actually want to have some content that is pre-formatted. So I want to put in here some content that I want the browser to display. I don't want it to display it a particular way. So I'm going to stick a little haiku in here. See if I can remember my haiku. And notice that I have spacing here so that the first and last lines are indented and the second one is not. And you'll notice that when we do the pre, that information in the browser normally gets rendered with this particular typeface, and it now does respect that white space. So if I put a bunch of spaces in here, those get rendered out now as visible white space within the document. So if you want the white space to show up, if you care about that, use the pre element in order to handle that for you. So we've got that. Now let's go in and look. If I do a span, I do another one here. Oops. We know that these are inline elements, and so if we look at them, they should appear right next to each other. They're inline elements. Even if I go in and put those on a second line, they're still going to show up. I do now, the carriage return does end up adding a space in there in this particular browser. But I have now all this information. Now, I want to add some breaks. I'm going to add some breaks because I want to actually have some white space at the bottom of this document. So every time I refresh it, it's not at the bottom of the page. But what if I actually don't want those on the same line? I can use the break for that. I put a line break in, I save, I refresh, and now we're going to see an actual line break in the document. So even though these are two inline elements, they would normally render on the same line, we can tell the browser, tell the client, please add a line break here at this particular point. Now, what if I want to separate these examples? Well, that's where the horizontal rule comes in. Or I can put that in and refresh, and you'll notice now I have a nice line above this first span, second span. I could do the same thing here between my white space items here and get that line to separate those items out. So again, kind of old school, but you can style that or make it appear different ways or use images to get the same effect. Finally, I want to use some character references. So let me go back in here. We'll follow our pattern here. And I want to identify now some content. I want to say maybe div. This is how you write a div. And what I want is actually to show this content in the page. I actually want you to see the div element here. And so let's do it like this. I want to do div. Well, you can already tell from the syntax highlighting in here that the client is going to expect it to be a div, and it doesn't show up. So I need to come in and use my character references. And now those items actually get rendered out. I can actually see the less than and greater than sign around the element. The browser knows that I want to render these character entities, not that I want to actually use a div within the markup. And finally, we'll look at the non-breaking space. So if we look at this paragraph, notice that it shows up in my browser. And as I shrink this, if you watch, as the words get close to the right-hand side, they begin to wrap and go around to the other side. So let's say I don't want it to break in some particular spot. So maybe I don't want it to break between this and course. So I'm going to put a non-breaking space in there. We'll refresh this. So now as we go, you'll see each word, as I expand, goes off the page But notice here, course doesn't go off the page. This end course goes off and on to the next line. So that non-breaking space tells the browser, do not break at this particular point. You could break at any other logical point, all right, left or right of this in the stream of text, but do not break at this particular point. I'm going to wrap up this section on text by talking about some available and even some common elements that you can use on the text in your documents. We have the super and subscript tags that you can use. Think about HTML being built for documents, research papers. This is pretty critical to be able to have superscripts and subscripts, whether it's for creating notation of equations and having powers, or for calling out footnotes or endnotes that you want to allow somebody to go reference. We also have the cite element, which is simply a wrapper around a person's name or some text where you want to cite work by another person. And so typically this will get rendered out in the browser as some italicized text. We have the abbreviation and acronym elements. And these allow you to use these items, these acronyms and abbreviations in your document, but also to provide the expanded text that goes along with that as an attribute. This allows somebody usually to hover over the acronym or abbreviation you're using and then be able to see the expanded out text. So it's very helpful. I remember from my English classes, it was always recommended that the first time you use that acronym or that abbreviation somewhere that you also pair with it the full name. So these allow you to do that. We have the emphasis and the strong elements. The emphasis is typically rendered as italics and strong as bold. These are some tags that were originally there, and typically today you would use a style sheet if you actually want to have text get rendered with a particular font style in your document. So you might make something a span and then use style sheets to apply that there. We've got a few others for code and samples, as well as keyboard and variables. Again, this was built by techies, so documents that you're creating that might have code or might have sample output, or if you have keyboard input or variables that you're specifying, you can use these elements to call those out. Typically, the browser will render those often like it does the pre-formatted text in terms of the font face it uses, but generally won't pre-format or do other things with it. Then we have the quotes. So block quote, we saw an example earlier where you'd have a chunk of text and you want to have it rendered out as a quote. Typically that becomes an indented block level element with all the text in it. And the Q element is for inline quotes. So more of an inline element, much like a span, if you're in the middle of a sentence or you just want to call out that somebody is being quoted and put that text inside the Q element. Now with these, with a block quote and the quote, you can also specify a URL to tie into where that citation is coming from. So you can indicate that this particular quote is coming from a particular document out on the web and give somebody the ability to reference that information. Depending on the browser, that may or may not render out in any discernible way, but it is good to provide that reference in there as you're quoting someone else's work. I've expanded my overview document here for the HTML Fundamentals course. And I have a paragraph that describes the course and provides the overview. Now in there I use things like HTML and IE for Internet Explorer. In another paragraph I'm talking about CSS and HTTP. These are all things where I want to call out that these are acronyms or abbreviations. So I use the acronym element here to wrap up HTML. You can see I'm able to apply the title attribute and call out that what that stands for is Hypertext Markup Language. Or the abbreviation tag, similar concept, I call out that IE is an abbreviation for Internet Explorer. So we look at that, what that looks like. When we render here, you'll notice that HTML just shows up as part of the text. It doesn't render any differently, but if I mouse over, I see the expanded title for Hypertext Markup Language. Likewise for the abbreviation, I see that says Internet Explorer, CSS is Cascading Style Sheets, and HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So it gives me an easy way to use those abbreviations and acronyms, but also provide for people the expanded title of that particular piece of text. Another item I have down here is in this particular paragraph, I talk about the fact that we don't cover certain topics because they're covered in other courses. And I'm going to later want to create these little links through a footnote or citation or note citation here to those courses. So I have a little 1, 2, and I put it in the superscript tag here. So as we go look, that gets rendered out. You can see raised up and shrunk a little bit above that as a superscript for those items. And I can, within that superscript, then add links and other items within that text if I need to. And I have some quotes and some citations here. So I have a little blurb here where I'm saying this is some history about HTML. And I want to say that Tim Berners-Lee is credited with creating the World Wide Web in HTML. And I'm going to cite Tim Berners-Lee. So I just wrap that up, and typically that renders out in italics, where then I'm going to also provide a quote from him. So I use the block quote to say, here's a chunk of text. I want you to do block quote formatting on it. And again, the white space, we can clean this up a little bit. And you'll see that the white space is going to get ignored as it does the block quoting. But for the citation, really, you're just calling out a person. This is primarily just informational that you're citing a particular person. And then the block quote actually has the cite attribute where I'm then going to point to the document where I got this quote. And this does, in fact, point to the document that was authored by him, a draft around the World Wide Web Initiative. And this quote was pulled from there. So I provide that as the link. So if we render that, again, you can see that the block quote is just going to render based on the wrapping, but it does get indented differently than a paragraph. So it is called out, and you kind of notice that it is a quote. The citation simply gets noted here by changing the font face or the font style to an italicized version. And you'll notice that if I look at these things, there isn't really any indication of the URI. So if I wanted to be kind of transparent, I would probably put a footnote link or some sort of a way for people to actually link to that document. But it's good to put those citation attributes on there so that in your HTML you have tied to that citation or that block quote a particular URI, so that somebody who's maybe not using a browser but that's following this or a search engine might be able to see that block quote and see that you have a citation to another document and help you and help other users navigate the web. Now, some of these items, as we've seen, are useful in providing us this information. So the acronym is there. One of the things you may have noticed, though, is there's no visual indication that mousing over this might actually be helpful. There's nothing that tells me that that's an acronym until I mouse over it. And so this is where we get into kind of leveraging other things outside of HTML proper into maybe using style sheets. So I'm not going to use styles extensively in this course except to show some particular examples. And so what I have in the header here is a style for these things, and I've commented out. And this is another important piece of using text within your markup, that if you have a block and you do the less than, exclamation mark, and then 2 dashes, that starts a comment. And then 2 dashes and the greater than symbol completes it. You can see everything is grayed out now because it considers it part of the comment, and that closes my comment block. So I'm going to lose those, and I'm going to add the style in, and what this says is anywhere you see an acronym element, color it green. So I'm going to save that. We'll change that, and now you can see that those acronyms are called out. They're green, so now I think, oh, I wonder what that is, and I'll mouse over it and get the example. Notice that because IE was an abbreviation, it's not called out, but I could do similar things with the abbreviation as well, or apply the same or similar style. Likewise, I have this highlight applied here, so we can just see, as we drop back to the initial where we talked about block versus inline, my span of HTML drives the web has a class of highlight, and I've said anything that's set up as highlight should be underlined. So we can see that getting applied here as well, where we're using those text elements to, within a paragraph, call out a particular block of text with a span and do something with it. In this case, I applied a simple style. You might change the font or the color. a variety of different things you might use that span for, but it allows me to specify that little chunk of text and do something with it without changing the flow of the document and continuing to allow that paragraph to be rendered as it was intended. In this module, we've seen that we can use headings to break up our document into logical and visual sections. We should use that H1 as our primary content identifier. We learned about block versus inline elements and how the browsers treat those and how we can nest them or not nest them. And we also saw that in a lot of cases you have to be explicit about your white space. Whether you use the pre-element to get pre-formatted text, you're using line breaks or horizontal rules to get those breaks, you want to be explicit about that to make sure that all browsers render your content correctly. And we also saw a variety of tags for rendering your text correctly or correctly marking up your document to identify citations and quotes, to use super and subscripts or otherwise call out text that fits into your document in a way that's not simply a paragraph of plain old text.